Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. Welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast. I really appreciate everyone for coming by. I am so sorry for these top of the hour technical difficulties. I was trying to get the intro to play. I love Ecamm Live, okay? It's great. It does a lot of really wonderful things. Unfortunately, it can be a bit hard to use, especially on the fly. At times, you have to do everything in a very specific way that just doesn't work with my autistic ADHD brain. I just want to be able to click and do a thing and just go, and it doesn't. You have to be very specific and like super accurate, and it's just so frustrating. At times and moments, when I'm struggling to do something, or in this case, I changed where the file for the NewsHour is located, and like most computer programs, it does not track when you move a file, and so I needed to go grab the file, and it just became a mess. So, and I needed to re-add it, and that was a mess, and it was stupid as I opened things up. I opened things early to try to get ready for it, and I've been prepped for this all day, and all of my preparations, the best laid plans, fall apart the minute you meet the enemy. Technology, someone years ago when I was like 21 always said anticipate technology failing and have a backup plan for that. And never a truer statement, might I add. So, welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast. And the Cameron Journal Newshour. I did 2 podcast recordings today. My brain is everywhere. This is the Newshour, the Cameron Journal Newshour. Thank you so much for coming to the Cameron Journal Newshour. We have a whole host of things this week to talk about, but there are kind of two things I kind of want to dive into, kind of right at the jump. One, I was in conversation today with my friend, my very leftist friend out in the West Coast. Actually, he's a communist. That's how far left he is. So we don't always see eye to eye on things. But he and I were talking, and I said, I get the impression from the reaction people are having to the Democrats and Trump and this whole present situation. I don't have to listen to anything, so I don't need these. Actually, need these on. Um, the whole present situation and all this type of thing. That people are really looking for the left's version of Trump. What do I mean by that? I mean the following. Trump has continuously been out there running for president, being president, running for president, and then being president for 10 years. And so he's had, for people on the right, especially MAGA people, they've always had him, his movement, as a touchstone to always go back to always believe in, to always have a new narrative, criticizing the Biden administration, criticizing the Obama administration as he was getting ready to run for president, all this sort of thing. And so there's been this, and then we had the whole QAnon thing, and so we've had, they've had that constantly. And I think one of the things, the left is looking for is someone like that, someone who's always out there, always out front, always, giving a message, always, something that I can, sort of something that they can always touch into and believe in, and this kind of thing. Traditionally, and this kind of gets into tradition, traditionally that's not what presidents have done. That's kind of what makes Trump's different. Traditionally, when presidents leave office, they go away. They get the hell out of town, and you don't necessarily really hear from them until the inevitable speaking engagements, which most average people never hear about, or the book deal. So you'll see them on talk shows some months later, all this sort of thing. Now with podcasts, you'll see them on a podcast or two, all this type of thing. But there's usually, a sort of going away. In fact, I was reminded of the fact that Lewis Black said one of the problems Hillary Clinton had in 2016 was that she never went away. She was always out there. She was always around. She was always in the mix because they went from the White House. Bill left. She ran for senator of New York. She was senator for 2008, ran for president, lost in the primary to Barack Obama, became Secretary of State, and then ran for president in 2016. So really between like 1992 and 2016, we kind of had this constant, her constant presence. And he kind of credited that with her loss in 2016. Trump has no compunction, and Trump's very good at being in front of the media. That's part of what he does. That's part of his thing. And so that, that is, a kind of a big, part of his appeal, I think. And so I think what people are really wanting from the left is something like that. Kamala Harris has followed tradition. She's out of office. She's gone away. No one has heard a peep from Joe Biden in a month. And so I think people on the left are looking for that type of opposition party leader, much more similar to what they do in Europe. In Europe, when you're the opposition party, you're in parliament, you're, asking questions, you're forming a shadow cabinet, you're releasing statements, you're leading that point of view. Here in this country, we tend to, when you're in power and you're the majority party, you're in the spotlight, and when you're the party that's not in power, you're doing maybe stuff behind the scenes or legislatively, but you're not necessarily out in public. And this is especially true for the presidency. And I think what people are really wanting is for anyone on the left to be the leader that gets them through this, to be speaking out against this, to put themselves out against Trump administration, to, be running already. Someone on TikTok basically said it out loud, and they said she should already start running for president, as if presidential elections aren't long enough. And so my little thesis, and I kind of realized this in conversation with him, although I'd written it down, Trump has changed politics to where there's not this sort of gentlemanly, cordial, they have voted for you, I will go away and give you space. No, now we're living in Trump land. We're living in Trump's politics where, no, you don't go away. You stay in the arena, you stay fighting, you cause problems, you speak out for your supporters. You constantly, fundraise, criticize, sell new products, do new things, and kind of be out there, enforce a voice, an influencer, if you will. And I think, honestly, the first Democrat that figures that out, especially one in an elected position or one that could be in an elected position, the first person who figures that out is going to actually be in a very powerful position. Because if they can kind of replicate that sort of influencer sort of thing, they're going to immediately galvanize tons of support across racial demographics, across geographies. They're going to immediately galvanize a lot of support for anybody who is just unhappy with things currently going on. And so I think Trump has so changed American politics that now if you really want to run for president, you can't just, start the search committee 2 years out, maybe a year and a half out, and then have the formal announcement and then do campaigning. No, you need to be out there the entire time. You need to kind of be that voice sort of thing. And I think, even though it might seem like you're sucking the air out of the room for the person in office, I think that's kind of where politics is moving towards. And I didn't fully form that thought until I was on the phone with my communist friend. I think that's kind of where things are at now. As I've said before, I think the left is basically all but surrendered. We are waving the white flag over here. Please be nice to us as prisoners of war. And I think, there's definitely a big retreat. It's only been a month and 4 days, 34 days Trump's been in office, and only 1,500 more to go. And I think, I think that is, I think there's, people are still figuring things out, but I think it's still kind of a surrender situation. Now, that being said, whoever can put themselves out there and galvanize the support around themselves to kind of, put together back, the army and the people and give them something to believe in again, very similar to what Trump did in 2021, then that person's going to have a lot of support. And they're going to immediately have a national political profile. So I think politics have changed in a way that I don't think the Democratic Party understands at all. No new news there. Politics changes all the time. The DNC is completely unaware. And so I think, that would kind of be the question I would be asking of DNC consultants right now is, okay, we need, the party needs influencers. The party needs, people out and about having these types of conversations. And perhaps they shall start watching my show. But in the meanwhile, the other thing I wanted to kind of mention, and it was something that I worked on over December, and I haven't mentioned enough, and I want to start talking about it in pretty much every interaction I have with people. And that is kind of putting that aside. This political moment, we did not arrive here by accident, not by far. It was very intentional. Oh, there's a lot of factors. I've spoken on so many factors. There's a lot of factors involved. But the reality is we did not arrive here by accident. It was intentional. For my own self, I'm not woke, never considered myself with that. I never identify with that. People who've listened to this show or read my stuff for a long time know I never was terribly on the progressive bandwagon. I spent a lot of time criticizing a lot of the things that went on, like vilifying racists. I don't think they should be doxxed or thrown out of their jobs for saying something racist. Socially, we can distance ourselves from them. Socially, we can not be involved with them. But I don't think it's productive to go and ruin people's lives. And if anything, it cements that their opinion and galvanizes people to their cause, and we want the opposite of that to happen. However, I am concerned with creating society that helps everyone thrive, which in turn creates a thriving society. One thing leads to another. And I think right now we are in a crisis, but it's a crisis we can solve. It's a crisis we can work through. It's something that we can work on together as a country, as a society, to decide how the country should move forward. Obviously, right now with Trump in office, Elon Musk has a very specific vision of what he wants this country to be, and we are moving towards that at rapid pace. However, I think we need to stop thinking about just the price of eggs or the cost of living or whatever have you, and start to really think about what do we need to do to create a thriving society for everyone, and what specific policy steps can we take, beginning at the local level all the way to the federal level, in order to cause that to occur. And when we start having those discussions and start having those conversations, it's going to be a very different conversation about how things move forward. And I think people are hungrier and hungrier for that conversation. And they're hungry and hungrier to really, create a different sort of society than the one in which we have been living in, which is primarily controlled by billionaires who basically create a society that's good for them, but good for almost no one else. It's not fun to live in a country that's only really working for about 250 people. It's much better to live in a country that's working for everyone. And so this is a message I'm going to talk about more and write about more and mention more, but I wanted to say it first today. We did not get here by accident. It was intentional, but we can work together to create a new society where everyone can thrive, which will in turn yield us a thriving society. And that is a conversation we have not had in this country in almost 50 years, but I think it's well past time for us to start having it and having it in a meaningful way. So, with that all being said, I don't want to be here all night, and I took last week off. So, let's turn to the headline, shall we? Here we go. Boom, and boom. Here we go. All right, so this is not the story I want to start with. I want to start over here. So, I pulled up this tweet, but we're going to read the executive order here. So, last week, I think the date on this was the 18th, yes. Last week, Trump signed yet another executive order called Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies. This one's very interesting for all the reasons underlined and circled. And it says here, the President and the Attorney General, subject to the President's supervision and control, shall provide authoritative interpretations of law for the executive branch. No mention of the Supreme Court here. The President and the Attorney General's opinions on questions of law are controlling on all employees in the conduct of their official duties. No employee of the executive branch acting in their official capacity may advance an interpretation of the law as the position of the United States that contravenes the President or the Attorney General's opinion on a matter of law, including but not limited to the issuance of regulations, guidance, and positions advanced in litigation, unless authorized to do so by the President or in writing by the Attorney General. Now, what does this mean? And the person goes on here, but I'm going to offer my own opinion first. Is that you basically have a situation where different agencies, particularly environmental agencies like the EPA, write their own rules based upon the interpretation of congressional laws based on their own lawyers, who go into Supreme Court decisions and precedent and memos and all this sort of thing. What they're basically saying is no more of that. If you're going to do something, it has to go through the White House. This basically gives Trump de facto control over the entire federal government. So even if you are a relatively independent agency, you have to run everything through the White House and go along with their directives regardless. And it says here, and here's kind of where it gets dangerous and where we might be headed towards a constitutional crisis. So the circled positions of advanced litigation, that means court orders, restraining orders, and precedents set by courts previously. No federal employee can refuse to obey the president, even if a federal court orders them not to obey the president. That is where we get into a constitutional crisis, because if a court orders something and employees don't do it because the White House says no, then we have a constitutional crisis on our hands, because you have the executive branch negating the powers of the judicial branch, who's trying to check the executive branch. It also says it was preceded by a fact sheet, and it says here, the President and the Attorney General, subject to the President's supervision and control, will interpret law for the executive branches of having separate agencies adopt conflicting interpretations. Reigning and independent agencies including the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Security Exchange Commission. have exercised enormous power over the American people without presidential oversight. Um, this also, which kind of also gets into Trump wanting to revoke broadcast licenses for networks that do not have do not have their coverage or content going in a pro-Trump direction. It says here Trump needs to control the news so that all will be said as pro-Trump propaganda, which also creates a false majority in favor of everything he does. But there's something worse. It says when you do a Google search to find out if the president or AG can interpret law, it takes you immediately to Trump's order first, not to the Constitution. And this wasn't the case prior to the order, so it appears there's already something going on here. Previous to the order, when you searched for these topics, things like this came up. Not an order from the president. Here you see the president is not the final authority on law. As I mentioned, Supreme Court. As we see here, the judicial branch interprets the law, not the president. Now this led me to further investigation. What's going on is very interesting. And so he goes down and does another Google search and notes that AI is already changing things around, pulling from this fact sheet and the order rather than the Constitution. So the reality is that you have this kind of two principal situation where Trump is trying to seize back power from the judicial branch that has been vested in it since Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And then you have this kind of blanket violating executive orders will result in being fired. And that the courts basically cannot be able to stop them, and that, violating a court order is on the table. I was telling my friend today, and it's certainly the situation, that if Trump decides to say no to courts, now personally he has said that he always follows what the courts say. That may not be so true for Elon Musk and other people, but Trump says that he's going to go along with the courts. If ever they don't, and that can happen at any time, any day, any hour, it can happen while this sentence is leaving my mouth, we have a constitutional crisis, because that basically means the executive has all the power and they can interpret whatever laws they want to. They even need a law sort of thing. And the court, it eventually neuters the powers of the courts. That's a very dangerous situation, because then there's no process to get a grievance redressed. There's no process for justice. There's no process for the system to make one whole in order to counter any sort of executive action. So if you're a state and you get an executive order saying you have to comply with this, you would go to court and say, no, I don't have to, and here's why. With this, if they start ignoring court orders, that all goes away. And then we're in a constitutional crisis, and then possibly violence. So I wanted to bring this to everyone's attention, because this enters into quite dangerous territory. This is where having a system, a small r, Republican democracy, is very important, and this is what it looks like when you start to lose it. And I'm mindful of Benjamin Franklin's famous quote, "A republic, if you can keep it." Now, I want to... Oh yeah, we'll do this now. Okay, so this was a great Substack called The Hartman Report, guest writer of Greg Palast. I do not mean to start a conspiracy or a rumor. I find this interesting. This person, Greg Palast, writing for The Hartman Report, maintains his thesis is that if all legal voters were allowed to vote, if all legal ballots were counted, Trump would have lost Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and Harris should have won. This sounds like 2021 copium from the Trump side, but let's continue. The key numbers the part of this post that I thought was interesting were the key numbers. It says here, and we knew about some of this leading into the election, and it was covered well by particularly Rachel Maddow, but others. It says here 4,776,706 voters were wrongly purged from voter rolls according to U.S. Elections Assistance Commission data. We knew about that in 2022, and this happens every election cycle, and it's worse in red states than blue states. It says here, by August of 2024, for the first time since 1946, self-proclaimed vigilante voter fraud hunters challenged the rights of 317,886 voters. The NAACP of Georgia estimates that by election day, the challenges exceeded 200,000 in Georgia alone. No fewer than 2,121,000 mail-in ballots were disqualified for minor clerical errors, exemplar gratiae, postage due. At least 585,000 ballots cast in precinct were also disqualified. 1,216,000 provisional ballots were rejected, not counted, and 324 million new registrations were rejected or not entered on the rolls in time to vote. If the purges, challenges, and ballot rejections were random, it wouldn't matter. It's anything but random. For example, an audit by the state of Washington found that a black voter was 400% more likely than a white voter to have their mail-in ballot rejected. Rejection of black in-person votes, according to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission study in Florida, ran 14.3%, or 1 in 7 ballots cast. There are also the uncountable effects of the explosive growth of voter intimidation tactics, including bomb threats that closed 31 polling stations in Atlanta on Election Day. The nasty little secret of American democracy is that we don't count all the votes, nor let every citizen vote. In 2024, especially after an avalanche of new not going to let you vote laws passed in almost every red state, the number of citizens Jim Crowed out of their vote soared into the millions. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, since the 2020 election, at least 30 states enacted 78 restrictive laws to blockade voting. The race-targeted laws ran the gamut from shuttering drop boxes in black-majority cities, for the first time allowing non-government self-appointed vote fraud vigilantes to challenge voters by the hundreds of thousands. Throughout election seasons, the New York Times and NPR and establishment media write stories and editorials decrying vote suppression tactics, from the new ID requirements and new restrictions on mail-in voting. But notably, the mainstream press will never, ever, not once, will say that these ugly racist attacks on voters change the outcome of an election. Leading to the question, if these vote suppression laws, notorious example Georgia's Senate Bill 202, had no effect on election outcomes, then why did GOP legislators fight so hard to pass these laws? The answer is clear on the Brennan Center's map of states that passed restrictive laws. It's pretty much Trump's victory map, although it does not include much of the upper Midwest, which is interesting. So it didn't help them out in Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. It didn't help them out in Virginia. It didn't help them out in Nevada either. And then it goes on for a while, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but I thought the numbers were interesting. The race aspect of it was interesting. Before the 2016 election, there was a guy from Kansas named Scott Brownback that was going around selling this new voter roll purging software that did an absolutely terrible job. Now, Scott Brownback got drummed out of Kansas for his disastrous tax policies when he was governor that almost drove Kansas into the ground. So his second act was to go around selling this voter roll software that would help states and counties and voting districts clean up their voter rolls. It was found, especially if you had a difficult name, a similar name, oddly spelled name, to bounce you out of the system, whether you were legitimate or not. It was found to be incredibly inaccurate. His software never really got off the ground. Oops, that was my phone. His software never really got off the ground, but it definitely did kind of do enough damage. And let's forget how we got here. In 2020, for the pandemic, a lot of states and a lot of election boards and secretaries of state kind of, without assistance from the legislature, changed a bunch of rules about voting. The most significant one was states that had never allowed no excuse absentee mail-in voting suddenly allowed it, like in Pennsylvania. A lot of things happened. The Republican response, because Republicans control most state legislatures, was to immediately ban most of that stuff, prevent election boards and secretaries of state from making changes, all this sort of thing. That was kind of the move in 2021, extending from the 2020 election and onward. Also, they passed laws allowing for state legislatures to change the slate of electors at will in a couple of cases. And this was covered at the time, all this sort of thing. And, judging by these numbers and this research, it seems like it had the significant and desired effect. Now, longtime readers and listeners will know I am very much in favor of voter ID. I'm in favor of national voter ID, mostly so this can't happen. Rather than leaving it up to the states and all their pernicious issues, make it national, make it free. And then we can have a set standard that everyone has to follow. Much easier, and the states can take their voter roll marching orders from Washington. That's much better than leaving it to all of this mystery and leaving the states to do it themselves. That would definitely cut down on all of this. But some of these numbers are absolutely staggering. Like the 2 million mail-in ballots that were disqualified for minor clerical errors like postage due, all this type of thing. Absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. So like I said, I'm not trying to start a conspiracy. I'm not trying to say that Trump's win wasn't legitimate. Nothing along those lines. But I think this is an interesting sort of thing, and I think it is our responsibility down the road, starting in 2026, but also to 2028, to make sure that the voter rolls are honest, people who are supposed to be registered to vote are registered to vote, and that, if you're voting by mail, please use postage, and and also, and if you feel like you registered and you didn't get your voter card back from them, check in on that. Make sure to participate in democracy, because there's active efforts to make it harder for people to vote. As far as vigilante vote fraud hunters, those should be outlawed. I've seen people who do that. They will, and it's usually someone who's retired who has time. They will sit there and they will find some reason to contest every single ballot they can get a hold of, every person, compel them to come in and cure their ballot or prove they're a citizen or whatever have you, and just make it a huge deal in order to get ballots thrown out. That's extended before this, but you can do it more places now. And so now you have this, especially when you get these narratives that there's all, these people who are voting who shouldn't be voting and all this type of thing. You have screwed with what's supposed to be the most trustworthy elections in the world, and now we have this situation. So, the next story I want to get to is from the lovely Joyce Vance. And it's called Friday Night Massacre in the Military. This is fresh off the presses. This happened over the weekend. Friday night, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's black, and the Navy's top admiral, who is female, were fired, along with the most senior Judge Advocates General, JAGs, for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Air Force General Charles Quinn Brown, the African-American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and advocate of anti-racism training in the armed forces, has been replaced by Dan Raisin Kane. Kane is a retired Air Force lieutenant general with none of the traditional qualifications for this position, and whose return to active duty from retirement will require a legal exemption. Trump made it clear that Kane possessed the key quality he looks for in all his top-level appointees: loyalty. In announcing the selection, he recounted the story of meeting Kane in 2018 when Kane supposedly said, "I love you, sir. I think you're great, sir. I'll kill for you, sir." Trump claims he then put on a Make America Great Again hat. Laughing, Trump said, "You're not allowed to do that, but they did it." It forces the question, is Donald Trump trying to turn the military into a political weapon, just like he's trying, at least partially succeeding, in doing at the Justice Department? The Founding Fathers created a military with civilian leadership to minimize the prospect of a takeover by a military strongman. The principle of civilian leadership of the military is so deeply ingrained in Western democracies that it's a requirement for inclusion in NATO. I am obviously not an expert in how the military functions, but I am a student of democratic institutions and their vitality. So I look at what happened Friday night through that lens. Civilian control of the military was already in the hands of a former Fox News host with an admitted drinking problem, which is now public. Now, competent military leaders are being dismissed for no apparent good reason. And that's the heart of it. Why dismiss them? Why on a Friday night? Why so many and all at once? And why all the Judge Advocates General? Members of the JAG Corps, for instance, respond to legal questions about rules of engagement, targeting, intelligence law, and detainee operations. They are military lawyers whose core functions involve military justice and law of war. They offer advice on questions including what constitutes an illegal order, what's a war crime, what's a constitutional violation. Replacing their leadership with Trump loyalists could have serious implications for how the military reacts in a number of situations, including assisting with mass deportations and policing protests, which they are currently prohibited from doing by the Posse Comitatus Act. Members of the military take an oath to the Constitution, not a loyalty oath to the President. The idea of loyalty to the Constitution is deeply ingrained in the officer corps and among senior enlisted soldiers, but principles can be undercut, and the concern is what Trump and Hegseth are putting in motion. When I first came across this, I was really shocked. I mean, I wasn't surprised, but I was still shocked because, Trump's always going on and on about the military. But I think because there was so much pushback during the first term, particularly from Milley, but others, that he wants to have, as she said, everyone around him to love him, to be loyal to him, all this sort of thing, and to really be on board with whatever he wants to do. And I think also, to be honest with you, given that the rest of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is white, and he was the only black guy, and she was the only woman, it was kind of a, well, let's get the DEI hires out of here sort of thing, which is gross, you know. It assumes they lack competence. It assumes they lack experience. I mean, hell, look at that hardware. I mean, that's a lot of hardware, folks. Um, and so it is. This is just another instance of Trump changing the government to suit his own vision and going against long-standing traditions and norms and values of our country in order to enforce his own will. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It's another, sad moment for democracy. So it's really unfortunate, but I'm so glad that we have Joyce Vance here to walk us through it. Let's definitely move on to Ukraine. So, as everyone knows, we have a potential peace deal on the table to end the war in Ukraine. And the headline is great. Zelensky and Trump trade blows as feud escalates over peace talks. President Trump called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator without elections after the Ukraine president said Mr. Trump was in a web of disinformation. It says here, the simmering feud between President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and President Trump escalated on Wednesday when Mr. Trump mocked his counterpart in a post filled with falsehoods, calling him a dictator without elections. Brief drink. His comments came hours after Mr. Zelensky said the American leader had been, quote, caught in a web of disinformation, unquote, from Russia over the war in Ukraine. The pointed exchange was set off by a meeting of American and Russian officials to open talks on ending the war in Ukraine that excluded the Ukrainian government. After that meeting in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday, Mr. Trump suggested that Ukraine had started the war, a comment that brought a strong rebuttal from Mr. Zelensky on Wednesday morning. I would like to have more truth with the Trump team, Mr. Zelensky said in some of the most overt criticism yet of Mr. Trump in his view of the war in Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky summoning reporters to his presidential office in Kyiv, a building still fortified with sandbags, said that the U.S. president was living in a web of disinformation. In a post on his Truth Social account, Mr. Trump responded with a scathing attack on Mr. Zelensky. Quote, think of it, a modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the U.S. and Trump, will never be able to settle. As he did in making his assertions a day earlier, he misrepresented verifiable facts. The United States, for instance, has allocated $119 billion in aid for Ukraine, according to a research organization in Germany, the Kiel Institute, not $350 billion. Mr. Trump also suggests that the future security of Ukraine would not be an American problem. Quote, this war is far more important to Europe than to us, unquote, he wrote. Quote, we have a big, beautiful ocean of separation, unquote. The deepening feud threatens to undermine Ukraine's war effort and further weaken its position in the peace talks that have already started between the U.S. and Russia, notably without Kyiv's involvement. Mr. Trump's fixation on the U.S. being repaid for military and financial assistance over 3 years of war could put a stop on any future aid package to the war-torn country. Ukraine has long been dependent on regular American deliveries of air defense weapons, shells, and other types of ammunition to sustain its fight against Russia. Let's be honest, without the U.S., it would be very difficult for us, General Kyrylo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, said on Wednesday. Kyiv has pushed for a seat at the negotiating table with Russia, but Mr. Trump's portrayal of Moscow as a willing partner in peace talks and his dismissal of Mr. Zelensky as an illegitimate and ineffective leader risks further sidelining Ukraine. And then it goes into the elections and how the war is going, and the bodies piling up on both sides. And it says here, Mr. Putin said, here it says, why are they being hysterical, Mr. Putin said, apparently referring to the Europeans. Hysteria is not appropriate here. Mr. Putin said that Mr. Trump told him in their phone call last week that, quote, the United States expects that the negotiating process will take place with the participation of both Russia and Ukraine, unquote. Quote, no one is excluding Ukraine from this process, unquote, Mr. Putin said. Mr. Zelensky delivered his comments on the same day that Keith Kellogg, the retired general appointed by Mr. Trump as his special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, arrived in Kyiv for a 3-day visit to discuss possible ways to end the war. Speaking from Kyiv's railway station upon arrival, Mr. Kellogg said his mission would be to, quote, sit and listen to Ukraine's concerns. The United States, he said, understands Ukraine's need for security guarantees and the importance of sovereignty of this nation. Remarks that contrasted sharply with Mr. Trump's disparaging comments from the day before. Mr. Zelensky said he wanted to take Mr. Kellogg to the front lines so he could see the war firsthand. Hoping the visit might pierce Mr. Trump's disinformation bubble, he urged the American envoy to speak with civilians and soldiers and ask them, quote, whether they trust their president, what they think of Putin, and what they think of Trump after his statements, unquote. And that's the state of the situation in Ukraine. We're trying to get a peace deal going. Negotiations are happening that Ukraine is not present for, and Zelensky and Trump are fighting on Twitter. Yeah. Oh, this is a good picture. The 38th Separate Marine Brigade firing a Grad self-propelled 122mm multiple rocket launcher at a Russian target from Pokrovsk, front line of eastern Ukraine. Nice picture. So that's what's going on in Ukraine. If you've been wondering what the story is there, what's happening, why people are saying things on social media, that's kind of what's happening with the whole situation. I mean, any peace talks without Ukraine being present is insane. So whether that's actually going to happen or not remains to be seen. I definitely can see a scenario where the United States and Russia come to some sort of deal and Trump twist Zelensky's arm to take it. They've already tried to get Ukraine to sign up for a $500 billion debt to the United States to pay back everything. They're also have twisted their arm to get them to sell us rare minerals that are in Ukraine for the next 10 years. So I have a sneaky suspicion Trump's going to do a deal with Putin and Ukraine will just be forced to sign it. And I feel very sorry for Zelensky. And then obviously there's already a call for new elections. So they've already asked him, will you step down for peace? They're basically and this also Zelensky, getting rid of Zelensky is a priority for Putin for the simple fact Putin wants this is what he's always wanted, a Moscow focused regime in Kyiv. And if he can achieve that, things will go back to the way they were before the war, and Putin will be relatively happy, especially given that he's able to keep the territory that he's keeping. That's the end game here. So Zelensky's got to go. There's probably going to be a peace deal between the U.S. and Russia that involves Ukraine. Zelensky will get thrown out. A pro-Russian Putin puppet will get installed, and everything will go back to the way it was. Unfortunately. And then there's going to be a big rebuilding project, which is incredibly unfortunate, but will make for a great investment opportunity for certain people. Moving right along. I wanted to get I found this really great Twitter thread that went through the savings of the DOGE efforts. So for those of you that don't know, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that's not a real department, is being run by Elon Musk, and they are going around the government cutting jobs, ending contracts, and quote-unquote saving money. But when you dig into the numbers, they're not really saving as much as they would say. So they say that they've saved $55 billion. But thanks to this person digging into the numbers, including numbers that they've posted themselves from their own account, it's already not quite as much as it's supposed to be. It says here the single biggest ticket item is a DHS contract listed as saving $8 billion. That's a huge contract, but no, it's $8 million. They must have tried to automate scraping the FPDS form and failed. That means we're down to $8.5 billion in savings. The next three biggest ticket items are all U.S. aid contracts listed as $655 million each, so $2 billion total. Wow, a lot. Wait, these are IDVs, not contracts. The $655 million is the entire set-aside being triple counted. In the first 5 years, only $73 million was awarded and only 2 years remain. So now we're already down to 6.5. And then it also says the next biggest item is an IT services contract for the Social Security Administration worth $1 billion. Well, this contract spans 6 years, 80% has already been spent, and $240 million of savings will be spread over the next 3 years for $80 million a year. And it says here, and so basically the point was, out of all of this, is that even despite the people fired and all this type of thing, their top line number they're quoting is not nearly what it is based upon their own posting. Now, when people ask me about this, and I've talked about this in the NewsHour and all this type of thing, I'm not entirely opposed to going through and getting rid of government waste. They're about to go to the Pentagon. Lots of waste there. And the wastes are named Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. Lots of waste there. Wonderful. And they've announced that Trump has announced in their budget that they want to cut defense spending by 40% over the next 5 years at 8% a year, and Mr. Hegseth has already been notified about that. So there's already going to be a big drawdown on defense spending, which I have wanted to argue, I've wanted to happen for 10 years. So no complaints there. But I do think that the Department of Government Efficiency, who talks about transparency, should be honest about the savings that are there. And I think the most interesting part is, so far, unless I've missed something, they have not found anything fraudulent or poorly done. What they have found is a lot of money set aside for legitimate things that were authorized by Congress. Now, there was a kind of a weird story about Stacey Abrams and her $2 billion for her NGO. I found out what that was about, because that headline was running around. I found out that she it was part of, actually really just sitting on the board of this NGO who was working on rural electrification and sanitation services throughout the South, and they were going to be focus on doing that, and those were government grants set aside for that. And apparently the Biden administration just did that, but the money was already there, sort of thing. It doesn't look good. I don't think it's illegal or bad. And Lord knows people do need those things in the South. There's a lot of people who don't have access to sanitation, like sewers and septic tanks and things like that. And there are certainly areas that need electrification. But the fact that it was kind of, this sort of pop-up organization that has no history, not a lot of real staff, and they're getting $2 billion, certainly doesn't look great. Obviously, this is going to continue to be in the news. Obviously, this work is going to continue to go on. I would always encourage people, do not emotionally respond to every single headline you see. Keep calm, carry on. This was a very interesting story from the Times last week. Every 100 years, America produces a Robert Kennedy Jr. As everybody knows, RFK was confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary, and he wants to do a lot of things. He wants to raise food standards, get chemicals out of food, and he thinks that anyone who has a mental illness, is addicted, or on an SSRI should be sent to a wellness camp in order to detox for as long as it takes. That is how concentration camps in Germany started in the 1930s. It was the disabled people, invalids, and people like that. They cleared out the insane asylums first. And then the communists. And then some trade unionists that Hitler didn't like, political enemies. It took a while to get down to the Jews, actually. The Romani people, they were easily gathered up from their caravans and everything. There's a really beautiful movie about that, actually, whose name I can't remember. All of this sort of thing. I mean, this is how it starts, and I was very concerned about his comments on that, but I was also interested about the history of this in this helpful guest essay from Jessica Gross. And it says, the wrestling champion Bernard McFadden loved raw milk and cold plunges. He hated vaccines and despised white flour, which he called dead food. His greatest enemy after white flour was the American Medical Association. He thought that the sedentary weakness of the American people was a crime, and that overeating was wicked, writing, hardly a home exists that is not made unhappy to a greater or less extent by this habit, in a book called Strength from Eating. Strength from Eating features a photograph of the muscle man flexing his veiny, highly articulated arm right before the presses with the phrase, yours for health, written in Mr. McFadden's distinctive cursive underneath the photo. Mr. McFadden was a genius of self-promotion. He understood that flooding the zone with his ideas and his scantily clad body via tabloids, magazines, and radio was the key to spreading his gospel. A fit body like his thinking went, was a moral body. People could ward off all manner of deadly diseases without medical intervention as long as they took care of their individual health. According to a biography of Mr. McFadden, Mr. America by Mark Adams, vaccination, or as Mr. McFadden saw it, the unnecessary pumping of dead germs into the bloodstream, was lunacy. Mr. McFadden's ideas are served to millions of people every day via social media health influencers in the year 2025, but he is not of the internet era. He was born in 1868 and was arguably the most prominent proponent of alternative health practices from around 1900 until after World War II. He found common ground with politicians like Franklin Roosevelt and Hollywood celebrities like Rudolph Valentino. It is impossible to read about Mr. McFadden, who was using the term medical freedom in 1920, without thinking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., our new Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the raw milk drinking, vaccine skeptical, psychedelic loving, Make America Healthy Again movement that has coalesced around him, which is delightfully bipartisan. This is in the article I'm talking. Which is delightfully bipartisan. And it's kind of funny because being super healthy, crunchy, raw milk used to be a very left thing. Now it's a very right thing. And now there's just kind of a cacophony of both, which is really interesting. It says here, on the first day of his confirmation hearings, Mr. Kennedy described battling the ill health of our nation's children in much the same way McFadden did, as a moral crusade. Quote, "It is a spiritual issue and it is a moral issue. We cannot live up to our role as an exemplary nation, as a moral authority around the world, and we're writing off an entire generation of kids." For a long time, I thought the MAHA movement was simply anti-institutional, but that explanation falls apart upon examination, because the medical establishment has long argued for clean air, clean water, and better access to healthy food. I've never met a doctor who doesn't stress regular exercise. Many people have pointed out that Michelle Obama was concerned about childhood obesity, just as Mr. Kennedy is, and used her platform to encourage Americans to eat healthily and move their bodies. Of course, the vaccine skeptics are mostly just wrong, and they rely on poor and debunked studies to make their fractured case. Emphasizing Mr. Kennedy's lack of scientific knowledge and the other contradictions of the MAHA coalition goes some of the way of exposing his threats. For example, why believe in the curative power of some big pharma-supported medications like ivermectin but not others? Also, why aren't Mr. Kennedy's crunchy natural followers dogging him for investing in gene editing technology? It was only after I stopped trying to resolve the contradictions of Mr. Kennedy and his movement and started reading history that the source of his appeal came together for me. Many of the ideas Mr. Kennedy is pushing have been part of the American bloodstream for a long time. They may ebb and flow in popular culture, but they never disappear entirely. The trick is understanding why many of these ideas are at the forefront right now, and this awareness is key to combating MAHA's most dangerous notions. Make America Healthy Again is an emotional, not an intellectual movement. It's based on a fear of cultural and technological change, and it yields to charisma instead of bureaucracy. As the Atlantic's Shayla Love explained in December, MAHA gives its followers a sense of certainty, an outlet for mistrust, a pseudo-religious belief in the natural, and an affirmation of modernity's limits. It also gives them a sense of control over their own bodies and the bodies of their children when faith in all our institutions is at a low point. It goes on. I wanted to talk about McFadden to point out that RFK's health crusade is not new, and I was mindful. The book mentioned I was reminded of because I think I've seen that book before. I used to work for a lady who was very into this. She was into raw milk before raw milk was cool. She was into the stuff a long time ago in 2009 and 10 when I worked for her, at my first magazine, Liberty Journal. And, it's been around, it's been bubbling underneath, but I did not know there was someone in the early 20th century who was advocating for that type of thing. I kind of knew there was kind of a basic, like, natural living healthy movement, but I didn't know it had a face, didn't know it was this guy. Fascinating. So, if you want to go check this out, feel free. It's Every 100 Years in America, produced by Robert Kennedy Jr. Go check it out on the New York Times. It's absolutely fascinating. We're coming to the top of the hour. I probably want to save that for next week. Too. And that was about DOGE, and I probably don't want to read that at all. So, I think we're going to end on that, actually. Let me change this back to here. Because we're almost at the top of the hour, and I don't want to... The All Men Need Heroes article is cool. But it gets into a greater conversation about men and masculinity, including someone I interviewed this week whose interview will come out in April, and I want to have a bigger conversation about that. So, we're not going to do it right now. We're going to take a break because it's been a long day for me. I've already done 2 recordings today. It's been exciting, but I love you all so much for coming and watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure to keep an eye on the Cameron Journal this week. We have great interviews, including Nikki Ballou. Will be out tomorrow. He's a great businessman for my business listeners. If you want to hear a story of a woman whose husband was from Palestine, who lived in Palestine in the 1970s, I believe, and whose husband was involved in the Palestinian Authority, Dixie Ann Halaj, that interview is up now as well. And also, most importantly, the interview with Dr. James Augsbury, whose book is coming out next week, who I helped edit and put together, is also available today. So check out this week's interview. The newsletter from Saturday did not reach everybody like it was supposed to. We're still having some issues there, so make sure to go read that. We have great and exciting content for you all week long. So, My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. Thank you so much for keeping up with us. If you want to follow me on social media, head over to CameronJournal.com. The links are at the top. You can't miss them, but I'm at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, at Cameron Journal, pretty much everywhere else. And I'll see you next Monday. So talk soon, everyone. Bye-bye.